I am Amara Quinn, a forensic compliance specialist, the person agencies call when a financial pattern stops making sense and someone needs to follow the thread. I had just set a payout check worth $130,000 on my counter when the knock came so hard it rattled the frame, and before I could breathe, my mother pushed inside with her voice already cutting through the air that I needed to hand that check to Lydia right now if I wanted to stay part of this family. I watched her eyes fix on the envelope like it belonged to her, and the certainty in her tone pressed against the room until my father stepped in behind her, demanding I stop wasting time and do the responsible thing. Lydia hovered near the doorway, shaking hard enough that her bag slipped against her shoulder. And when she whispered that she only needed a bridge to make it through Monday, the tremor in her voice confirmed the audit notice sticking halfway out of her folder. My mother leaned closer, insisting there was nothing to think about and that I needed to sign it over before things spiraled for all of us. While my father muttered that I'd been given chances other people would kill for, and it was time I finally paid something back. I glanced toward the folder again, catching the seal from her company's internal review board. A detail she hadn't meant to show, but one that told me exactly how deep the damage ran. I kept my hands steady. And while my pulse rose, I didn't step back, as Lydia pleaded that everything could be fixed if I acted fast and didn't complicate this more than necessary. My mother gripped the counter, urging me to stop pretending I didn't understand the stakes and reminding me Lydia's future was hanging by a thread that I had the power to hold together. My father added that I needed to quit playing expert and transfer the money before someone else at her company connected the wrong dots. And in that moment, the room settled into a pressure I knew too well, as the audit notice shifted again inside her bag, like a silent admission waiting to detonate. I let my shoulders loosen just enough for my mother to believe the pressure had cracked something in me. And with her eyes locked on mine, I breathed out that I could help but needed a minute to think, because a transfer that size would trip every federal algorithm tied to my payout. My father snapped that I shouldn't invent obstacles when their entire future sat on my kitchen counter. And Lydia's voice barely held together as she begged me not to let the audit catch up with her before we fixed this. I kept my gaze low so none of them would notice how quickly I reached for the laptop. The same movement I used at work when I needed someone to underestimate what came next. I tapped through compliance templates with my mother hovering so close I could feel her anticipation. And when I murmured that there was one way to move the money without raising federal scrutiny, she leaned in like the solution had always been mine to provide. My father pushed that if I knew a path forward, I needed to stop hesitating because Lydia's company wouldn't wait while I second-guessed myself. I slid the screen slightly away from them while explaining that the only route exempt from scrutiny required labeling the payment as restitution for an inadvertent withdrawal. And Lydia's breath hitched at the phrase like it offered her a doorway she could still escape through. I sent the form to her phone while I explained that the wording needed to be exact or both of us would get flagged. And Lydia fumbled through her bag until the notification chimed, and she whispered that she would do anything if this kept Monday from destroying her. My mother urged her to fill it out immediately before anyone changed their mind. And my father muttered that this was what family loyalty looked like when it finally mattered. I watched Lydia's thumbs move in frantic bursts as she typed the reason into the box, the text glowing across her screen with the same clinical finality I'd seen 100 times in internal investigations. I told her to double-check the spelling before she signed, because any discrepancy might cause issues when her company reconciled their audit files. And she tapped the signature line with a shaky kind of relief. My mother exhaled as if the crisis had dissolved the moment Lydia pressed submit. And my father nodded with the smug certainty of someone convinced discipline had put everything back on track. My own phone chimed with the completed document, the digital imprint revealing exactly what I needed, as Lydia asked how soon I could release the funds. And I replied that the transfer required a holding period before any bank would clear it, so they should all go home and rest while I finished the process in the morning. When the door finally closed behind them, I pulled the credit reports across my screen, expecting the usual annual check. And the moment 3 unfamiliar accounts appeared under my name, I whispered that this wasn't a mistake, but a pattern carved clean through my identity. The balances stacked into numbers I'd never touched while charges for hotel weekends, wellness retreats, and replacement appliances flickered through each statement like receipts from a life I hadn't lived. I printed the records as the room steadied around the evidence, each page confirming what Lydia's trembling folder had already hinted at when she begged me for help. I traced the dates of the oldest account, noticing how the signature block leaned toward my mother's handwriting. And the realization forced the words out that they'd been using me as collateral long before tonight's demand for the payout. Quiet settled just long enough for the rising sirens outside to slip under the windows. And when I looked out at the wash of red and blue lights turning into my street, my phone buzzed with a message from my father, declaring they were doing this for my own good. The timing matched too perfectly to anything but intent. And the pounding hit my door before the meaning of their choice could fully settle. I kept my headset in place, and my laptop open to a compliance spreadsheet as I walked to the door. And when the officers called for me to open up because a suicidal individual with a weapon had been reported, I answered mid-sentence about expense ratios not matching Medicare guidelines. Their eyes widened when they saw the quiet order of my apartment and the meeting reflected in my glasses, while voices from outside escalated into accusations that I was unstable and refusing to cooperate. The older officer met my gaze when I mentioned that the only weapon in the home was an over-budget quarter, and the shift in his shoulders confirmed he'd already matched the report against the scene. I gestured toward the room so he could see the paperwork laid out in separate stacks, and he murmured that they'd close this as a false report before asking me to stay inside while they handled the crowd building near the sidewalk. Through the window, I caught my mother's hand gripping Lydia's arm as my father tried to argue with the officers about my imagined state. And the moment the cruiser lights faded from my walls, I locked the door and returned to the documents waiting on my desk. The signatures remained exactly where I'd left them, aligning with the affidavit Lydia had submitted minutes earlier, and the contrast between their chaos outside and the clarity inside pressed the truth tight enough to decide what came next. I called Graham as the documents lay scattered across my desk. And before he finished confirming the timestamp on Lydia's affidavit, I told him the report from the officers matched exactly what we anticipated, which meant it was time to activate the lien we'd been holding. He paused only long enough to note that the redemption window on the Quincy property had closed the night before, then added that the transfer paperwork sat ready for my authorization. I stared at the credit statements beside the affidavit and answered that I wanted the deed filed immediately because the timing now aligned with everything they had pushed into motion tonight. Graham mentioned that a petition had appeared in the court system an hour earlier claiming I was exhibiting financial instability, and when he added that the request sought temporary guardianship under my parents' authority, I felt the last missing piece of their plan settle into place. He noted that the judge assigned to the filing required a preliminary review before granting an emergency hearing, which meant we had a narrow window to redirect the matter into arbitration instead. I told him to proceed with the private forum because the facts were cleaner there, and he agreed, adding that my parents' attorney had already accepted the notice for a closed session in the financial district the following day. I reviewed each document on my screen until Graham asked whether I intended to bring the identity theft records into the session, and I replied that the statements were still on my counter with the ink drying from the printer. He asked about the affidavit Lydia submitted earlier, reminding me that its phrasing could carry heavy implications once introduced alongside the audit timeline, and I confirmed that her wording made the intent unmistakable. He then asked how I planned to handle the payout at the center of their argument, and I told him the check remained untouched because its presence alone illustrated the leverage they believed they had. We scheduled the arbitration for early morning before his next case rotation, and when he concluded that the panel would require every party to appear under oath, I answered that they would come because they believed this was their final chance to contain me. After the call ended, I gathered the printed records into a single folder, and as the edges aligned beneath my hand, the room settled with the quiet recognition that tomorrow would no longer be about defense but confirmation. The arbitration room carried the kind of stillness that made every movement sharper. And as I sat across from my parents and Lydia, my father leaned back, declaring that we were here because my behavior had spiraled, and they needed legal authority to stabilize my finances before I hurt myself again. My mother clutched her bag while insisting they had watched me unravel for months and had begged me to accept help. Then Lydia added that I had promised to support her business before becoming erratic and unpredictable. The panelist nodded for the record to continue, and the court reporter's keys clicked in quiet bursts, as each claim landed in the center of the table like an accusation waiting for a target. Graham tapped the folder beside him and remarked that the testimony seemed incomplete without the documentation provided less than 24 hours earlier. Then lifted the first printout displaying the affidavit Lydia had submitted as part of the transfer request. My father scoffed that no internal form could outweigh their first-hand experience, and my mother whispered that she doubted I had even understood what Lydia truly needed. Lydia's face tightened when Graham read the highlighted line about repayment for an inadvertent withdrawal of $180,000, and her breath snagged when he asked why her sworn statement contradicted her claim that the funds were meant for business expansion. My father cut in, insisting that Lydia had only used whatever phrasing I forced her into because I manipulated the situation. And my mother urged the panel not to let formal language overshadow the truth about my instability. Graham reminded them that the document was time-stamped at their home, while none of them had objected to submitting it. And he added that the wording matched the category reserved for financial misappropriation during compliance reviews. Lydia's pulse fluttered in her throat when he traced the section acknowledging attempts to avoid audit discrepancies. And my mother's hand trembled enough to rattle the metal trim of her purse. When Graham placed the second stack of papers on the table, my father demanded to know why unrelated documents mattered. And my mother raised her chin, insisting those accounts were imaginary or twisted out of context. Graham laid out the credit statements one by one, noting dates, addresses, and matching signature blocks. And I could see the moment my father recognized the handwriting that repeated across the forms. My mother let out a fractured breath when Graham stated that federal law classifies unauthorized use of another person's credit for more than $5,000 as identity theft. And my father muttered that raising a child entitled them to whatever helped the family survive. Graham shifted to the final page and mentioned that the Quincy property was no longer a hypothetical concern, then angled the deed toward the panel so the ownership line caught the light. My father lunged forward, demanding how any of this could be possible when the house was theirs, and my mother clung to his arm, asking whether the document could be a clerical mistake. Graham clarified that the tax lien's redemption period expired the night before, and I added that I had covered the overdue taxes years earlier when new furniture appeared in their living room instead of a payment toward the county. My father's voice cracked when he accused me of betraying them at their lowest, and my mother begged the panel to see how unthinkable it was for a daughter to evict her own family. Graham closed the folder and stated that the panel would not rule on emotion, but on the evidence presented, then slid forward the confession of judgment and voluntary no-contact agreement, prepared for their signatures. Lydia asked in a fading whisper what would happen if they refused, and I answered that the audit board would receive her affidavit before they left the building, while the credit statements could be forwarded to the appropriate federal office without delay. My father's jaw tightened as he stared at the forms, and my mother's fingers shook so violently the pen tapped twice against the table before she steadied it. Lydia signed last, with her eyes fixed on the blank stretch of wood in front of her. And when the pen finally left the page, the room exhaled as though the weight of every detail had finally settled into place. The signatures dried on the final page before anyone stood, and as the panel dismissed us, Lydia brushed past me with a hollow whisper that she hoped I realized what I'd done to her life, while my father muttered that no court could erase blood even if I pretended otherwise. My mother tried to steady her voice as she asked whether I felt proud of turning my back on the people who raised me, and the hallway swallowed the rest of her words as the three of them moved toward the elevator, carrying the weight of their own documents. I waited until the doors closed before letting the quiet settle long enough for the room behind me to release its grip. Lydia's board moved fast once the audit team received the affidavit, and the notice confirming her removal from executive authority arrived the next afternoon with a timestamp that aligned exactly with the submission. My parents left Quincy under the terms of the confession without making a scene, and a neighbor later mentioned they'd taken a small rental in Weymouth after leaving behind the house they'd once guarded so fiercely. I sold the property within the month and used the proceeds to clear every remaining trace of the accounts opened in my name. Watching the balances fall to zero, as if the numbers themselves had finally stopped arguing with me. I chose Salem for my next home because the distance felt clean. And when I carried the last box through the doorway, the air held none of the tension that used to follow me from room to room. A friend asked whether I regretted how far things had gone. And I answered that regret requires believing another road would have led somewhere safer than the one I took. I placed the payout check in a drawer that didn't exist in my old life, letting it sit untouched because I no longer needed it to prove anything to anyone. On my first night there, I stood in the kitchen long after the lights dimmed, and the quiet made it impossible to ignore how different the room felt compared to the night Lydia asked how soon I could move the money. I remembered the way she searched my face then, hoping I hadn't noticed the audit seal slipping from her folder, and the memory passed through me without the ache it once carried. When sleep finally came, it arrived easily, as if my body recognized the absence of footsteps waiting to knock on my door with new demands. By the time morning settled over the windows, the house felt undeniably mine, and I knew I had stepped into a life I didn't have to earn through endurance. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If any part of my story feels familiar to the corners of your own life, I hope you find peace where you once found pressure. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'd like to know how far this moment reaches.